10th time's a charm. You know?
Yeah, so we're about to get started. So my name is Sebastian Bae. I'm an adjunct professor at Georgetown University, and I'm the faculty advisor for the Georgetown University Wargaming Society. Today, I will be moderating the panel on wargaming education. We have some amazing panelists for you today, and I'll let them introduce themselves. So I'll start on my right-hand corner at the top. So Dr. James Sterrett, I hand it over to you. Then it'll be Kristan Wheaton and Dr. Kyleanne Hunter.
Hello, I work at the Army University and the Command and General Staff College. I work in a directorate called the Directorate of Simulation Education. We can have two pieces. We teach the use of mission command systems, and in my piece of it, we teach the use and support the use of simulations and war games across CGSC. Thank you.
Chris?
Yeah, good morning, everybody. My name is Kristan Wheaton. I'm the professor of strategic futures at the U.S. Army War College, and I've been a lifelong gamer. I run two gaming companies. One I ran straight into the ground, and have been designing and playing games my whole life. And for the last 20 years or so, have been trying to figure out how to better integrate games of all type, not just war games, into the classroom.
Kyleanne?
Hi, I am Dr. Kyleanne Hunter. I am a professor of military and strategic studies at the United States Air Force Academy and an adjunct at Georgetown with Sebastian. We have like our nice life together. I am probably the newest, I think, to the wargaming world in this group, but have one of the courses that I teach here and am redesigning is our air power and joint operations, and have worked on creating some very simple pedagogical war games to get cadets really involved in these big complex issues and concerns. So that's where my focus is, and excited to talk to you all.
So on that note, I would love for each of you to sort of explain how you guys use wargaming or teach wargaming in education, whether as an educational tool or actually teaching designers how to design games. So we'll start back again with James.
The answer is kind of all of the above. So with Mike Dunn, my co-conspirator in crime and doing the instruction at CGSC, we teach courses on how to choose and deploy war games into education and training missions. We teach courses on exercise design. We teach a course, two courses really, on war game design. One of them is a short thing in electives. One of them is a year-long part of the CGSC master's program. We also support instructors in using these in their own courses. So we hit both sides of this, and it's pretty extensive.
Hey, Chris?
Sorry, I was sitting there thinking about the answer to the question. So I came up with a really startling realization a number of years ago that all games teach something. And I know that sounds pretty simplistic, but it actually, I think it's actually pretty profound when you start to dig into it. All games do actually teach something. And so my goal was, I started out sort of trying to get more wargaming into my classes, because I learned a lot as a young man playing, traditional sort of board games, war games, the old Avalon Hill and all that sort of stuff. And learned an awful lot when I started designing my own stuff as well. Sort of delved even more into it, and felt like that was a really great way to learn a lot of sort of strategic, operational, tactical. I mean, even geographic, right? So, a map, traditional hex map teaches you an awful lot about geography. Just implicitly, you learn that sort of stuff. So I always thought that was really great. But then when I started to apply it, I found that, boy, that just ran into a brick wall with a lot of students. And so I started to become more expansive in how I looked at games and gaming in the classroom and how to use it. And I'm really interested to hear what Kyleanne has to say, because it sounds to me, she and I are on the same exact wavelength, this idea of simple pedagogical games. That's kind of where my focus is right now, is trying to figure out how do I create games that work within sort of the time limits that you have in a traditional classroom, right? An hour, 2 hours, whatever you've got, but also communicate some of these higher level concepts in a way that's better than sort of lecture and discussion. In other words, it can't just be different. It's got to actually do that stuff better. I've designed a couple of games that have done that, or I think they've done that. Certainly my experience with them is they've done that. I'd like to actually see a lot more, and I'm going to be talking more about that as this goes on. Anyway, thanks.
Yeah, I think this tees up very nicely, because I think, Chris, exactly to your point, I was looking at the content that really I was charged with teach, which was taking essentially college students, because I think people forget often at military academies, and I know there's a lot of folks on this call who have familiarity with students at military academies. Everyone assumes like, oh, they're in the military. Like, no, they're college kids in cool pajamas is really what most of them are. So how do you take college kids and convey to them what operational planning and design is, really from starting at the big sort of national security strategy level, going down to actually creating an operational line of effort? And so that's a big daunting task. And a lot of it's honestly really dry. If you think about your average like 20 to 22-year-old, when sitting there like, well, here's why you should care about the NSS. They're like, you can see them falling asleep. And so I thought, I'm like, well, what's a way to actually get them engaged and involved? And as Seb knows as well, I am a huge like Marvel Comics nerd. Like, I love it. Like, the Marvel universe is, I think, one of the best places in the world to get to work from. And I think, Chris, to your point of like, you can learn a lot about geography, history from games. There's also a really good, I think, place for speculative fiction and science fiction in teaching these real critical military concepts in particular. And so to do this, I created a game based on Wakanda, the country of Wakanda, entering the international system for the first time. So here's a country that is advanced economically. It has a strong military tradition, but it's brand new in the international system. So there's no sort of legacy of colonialism that's part of it. There's no legacy in the past of the wars. And my game was essentially, okay, you're competing with every other country to get Wakanda to be your ally. How do you go about doing it? And set up a series of different moves. I can get more into some of the mechanics, or I should encourage you to all attend the GU Wargaming seminar in June to learn more about the mechanics that were here. But each week, as we unveiled a different strategic concept, they were forced to make a decision and justify it based on, foundational principles of our strategy or actual warfighting principles that we have. So, what I found was that using this sort of speculative fictional universe, you could really convey these concrete topics that feel dry and complex and hard in a way, and it also keeps them really engaged. That's one of the things, like, and happy to talk about more of this later on. Like, when Chadwick Boseman died last year and we were working through this, like, the cadets came with a whole new scenario into this game that they wanted to pursue, a whole line that wasn't initially part of their choice options. But the fact that they say, no, look, there's been this major disruption, we need to evolve. And I think when we think pedagogically, like, that's exactly what we want students to do, is to say, like, here's more of what we should be doing here.
So personally, I love hearing about specific games at other universities and other classes. So I would love to invite James and Chris in that order to talk about a game that they use at their respective institutions.
There's sort of a logjam trying to get that out because I use a very large number. However, you having warned me about this, I'm going to highlight two. And this is in absolute agreement with the others, that you want something that's simple, you want something that fits the time. We've had enormous amounts of success with Battle for Moscow, the old Frank Chadwick GDW freebie introductory war game, as updated by Victory Point, as a introductory game in a variety of situations. It's simple, it's easy enough to teach. It's for the game design class that we lead the game design class with this. It's got flashes of deep elegance that we can then refer to through the rest of the class. We find that we can typically get people to play enough of it inside of an hour to go on to the discussion. Enough meaning there's no need normally to finish the game. And in fact, I've found that it is often actively bad to have the game finish out. Not least because people often can see the end coming before, And you really want to end when each side thinks it's got a chance. If Sebastian has won and James has lost, then Sebastian is saying, well, I'm a genius. I have nothing left to learn. And we know that's true. And James is sitting there saying, well, this game was stupid. The class was terrible and I'm checked out. Whereas if both of us think we've still got a chance, then each of us saying, I was going to do this. No, I was going to do that. And the discussion afterwards, which is often where we're making meaning of the experience and pulling out the learning, is going to be far better. The other thing I'll put in a plug for is that older tools are often still very good. One of the things that we get a great deal of mileage out of is Kriegspiel, the old Prussian training game. We run it as free Kriegspiel. We run it up to 12 times a year. And we can practically guarantee that in the discussion afterwards, students will come up with at least 3 points. And one of them will be, gosh, I miss my radio, because we're running it with a full individually based fog of war with runners, the whole 9 yards. The second one is, now I understand mission command, because the structure of Kriegspiel means that you have to give an order in the game that is interpreted and executed by another human being. You don't simply click the mouse or push the piece and it does exactly what you told it. You've got to explain your ideas, often with a time delay, often to a subordinate who isn't going to be seeing what you can see. And third, and perhaps the most telling thing they say is, why aren't we doing this more often? I've frequently had students tell me it was the best thing they did in their year at CGSC. So just because it is older doesn't mean we should throw it out.
That is a great question. We'll pivot back to after Chris answers his games that he uses at the Army War College.
So when I was teaching at Mercyhurst University, I used to use a game by Decision Games called Showdown, which is a near future India-Pakistan war. And I like that game for a lot of the same reasons that James likes some of the games that he plays. First of all, geography was important there, and it gave my students who had no real sense they were good enough to be able to find India and Pakistan on the map, but they weren't good enough to be able to really understand how geography was driving avenues of approach and sort of how that conflict would take place. The second thing that they were unaware of is sort of just, and this is what I really love old school tabletop war games for, is that it really peels the layers off the onion, lets you see how the mathematics is done, forces them to sort of do many calculations in their tents, as Sun Tzu would say, and sort of understand what, how terrain, at least within the context of that game, how terrain changes, sort of odds, how it moves the thing around, and sort of how combined arms work, how to a lesser extent all the various different elements of modern conflict. The other piece I really liked about Showdown is that it includes nukes, at least tactical nukes, which is something that people really, I don't think enough about what kind of damage and how much destruction that kind of a war would entail. So I like Showdown a lot, particularly with my undergraduates, and it plays in about 3 hours. And just like James, we almost never got to the end, which is very good, right? I like that because we didn't ever have enough time to play it all the way through, and that sort of typically left things in an undecided way, and that does, I think, spur conversation. The game I use here, one of the games that I use here, you'll be surprised, is called, or I've heard it called Dutch Rules Tic-Tac-Toe. It's probably the simplest game that I use ever. Dutch Rules Tic-Tac-Toe is exactly like regular tic-tac-toe, but what you do is you change each side, the X's and O's have an exact number of pieces. So for example, I only have 3 pieces as the X player and 3 pieces as the O player. Each piece is numbered and they have to be played in order. So in other words, X1 and then O2 and then X3 and then O4. When you get to 6, you come back to X1, you actually have to pick that piece up. You can't put it back where you just took it from. You have to put it somewhere else on the board. So there's really only one rule change here between traditional tic-tac-toe, which is a boring game, which against competent players almost always ends in a draw. And all of a sudden it takes that boring game and turns it into a very strategic game, right? One where you have to plan several moves ahead if you're going to defeat your opponent. It really adds just a great layer of complexity to that. And I use that early on in my future seminar to sort of highlight how small, relatively maybe insignificant changes in the future can really change how you have to employ strategies and how you have to think about sort of what you're going to do and how you're going to do it, and how the things that you used to do. And almost inevitably, it's really cool when people are playing this game and they get to that first round, and the guy plays his O6 and the next guy picks up his X1. You can just see on their face, oh, all the things that used to work in tic-tac-toe, none of those work anymore, right? None of that stuff matters anymore. And it's just, you can just see their brains just sort of, the gears are grinding, smoke's coming out of their ears. It's a fantastic learning experience to just watch how a simple change in rules, in this case, can really change how conflict bears itself out. And I use it for that example because it takes 5-10 minutes to play, and it's just this. There's an emotional aspect to it, not really strong, but enough of emotional aspect to sort of lock in the learning. So Dutch rules tic-tac-toe I find really, really useful to sort of create that cognitive dissonance that you need to help prepare someone for learning. Anyway.
I love that, and I will most likely use it in the future. So you will probably see that at my classes. So I want to circle back to a comment that James said, right? That when his student says, "Why don't we do this more?" Right? And I want you guys to sort of address that, and we'll start with Kyleanne again.
Yeah, so I love that comment, and I think it's something that, as I think especially higher education educators, we need to actually take to heart. I think there's been for a long time this pedagogical model that the way you learn is I spew information at you, you regurgitate information back to me, and then I know learning has been occurred. It's not right. I think some of it, my background, like I'm a Marine in my background, if you can't tell from my huge flag in the back here too. And like Marines love war games. I'll say we are the service who probably loves them more than just about anyone else, up from like high level, but down to just even how we sort of fundamentally teach small concepts in terms of, getting you to do something. So I think, why we don't do it more, I think as professors, one, there's a fear that if we're not war gamers as it is, we can't use games in our classroom because what do we do? Like we're not war gamers. And I think there's been for a long time this sort of shroud of mystery around what war gamers is, that there's this sense that like they're this kind of like secret cloakland sitting behind computers running these big, huge scenarios all the time. Where I think, the example of Dutch rules tic-tac-toe is what's absolutely important here. Like you can use very simple games to teach things. And it's a new way, and it brings out a different type of learner. It brings out a different side of learning. I think, to that point of preparing people to learn, one of the things I love the most about using games, and not even war games, just simple games. Like I will have my cadets play Scrabble sometimes against each other just so they deal with failure. This fact of like they lost something and they're like, how am I going to do this? So I think we need to get out of this pedagogical mindset that wargaming only exists in security studies, that wargaming only exists sort of to solve these big, huge national security level issues, and push ourselves out of our comfort zone to actually say like, no, simple game. We all know how to play games. And I think once we got into higher education, there became this idea that, education's not supposed to be fun anymore. It's supposed to be hard. So that's what, I think we've done it to ourselves. And I think we have to listen to our kids and our students. And I think we have to be willing to get out of our own comfort zone, get out of our own way. Like it's not, sure, go play a game that you don't know the rules to. Ask your students what they want to play. Like that's how I think we learn a lot.
Yeah, that's amazing. So I think we will have to go back later on to talk about how do you incorporate war games as a non-war gamer. I think that's a fascinating angle that you provide to the panel. James, why don't we do this more?
In part because it is hard. And I say this as somebody who I frequently tell people that my mission is to manage to get a game played in every single class in every day of instruction across Army University, and the game that is unique to that class will be so good and so effective that every single instructor wants it to be there. And that last point is important. If the instructor's not bought in, it's not going to work. But doing that is very difficult, in part because you've got to begin at it with each of these cases, with each of these classes, by asking, what's the point of this class? What are the students supposed to walk out of this knowing that they didn't know before? And if we simply throw in the game because it's going to be a fun activity without reference to what's being learned, then we've chosen the wrong thing. We're not doing them a service. We're not doing us a service. So you've got to think, the model we use is PDI, purpose, decisions, interactions. Purpose is what's supposed to happen. And that also brings in things such as Chris and Kyleanne have brought up of, how much time do we have? How long is it going to take to teach? So on and so forth. We're then asking, given this purpose, given what the game, what's supposed to happen in the class, what they're supposed to learn, the role the game's going to play, what are the decisions and dilemmas that the students have to wrestle with so that they get to that learning, or they get to a place where we can have a discussion that gets them to the learning, however it's going to fit in. So we figure out those decisions, and then we can go off and try and find a game that has the interactions we need. Because fundamentally, any game, whether it's a first-person shooter or chess or whatever, has a cycle of present people with information, they get to make decisions, a model runs the situation forward and presents them with new information. On a first-person shooter, this is happening at below the second scale. On chess, you might be thinking for 5 minutes. On Battle for Moscow, you might be thinking for 5 minutes. But nonetheless, it's that same cycle that's creating opportunity for these dilemmas and decisions that we care about. And getting those lined up is difficult. The other side of it is that as the instructor, it is a third skill. Just like lecturing, just like running a discussion, just like grading, it is another thing to learn. And just as some people are better or more comfortable with a given format, that's true with this as well. It takes, in particular, it takes acceptance of chaos. If you're lecturing, you're in total control of the room, you think, you hope. The students may not be paying attention, but you're pretending you're in control up at the front. If you are running a discussion, one of the keys to running the discussion is having a light touch and letting the discussion run where the students want, while periodically tapping it back to make sure that you're hitting the points that need to be hit for the class. When you start running a game, people will not necessarily make the decisions you want. They may not run into the ambush. They may not make come to the dilemma you wanted. And you've got to be ready to try and make sure that you can still make meaning out of the event, whatever it might be. So all of these are impediments to moving in. The final piece of confession is that when I came to CGSC back in 2004 teaching this, one of the things that I struggled with, given my prior training as a historian, was, hey, I'm doing this job now. I should figure out how to teach history effectively. And you can do it, but it really takes the right game. And I think we may be getting to that question later. So I'm going to make sure that other people have time to chat, and we can cycle back to that if you'd like.
There is so much to unpack in there, and I have taken some notes. Chris, why don't we do this more at the War College?
So I'm going to be a bit of a contrarian here, because I looked at this. I mean, I did this, right? So I did this in my classes with lots of different kinds of games. I think the biggest reason we don't do it more is time, right? So war games, I mean, even a game like Showdown, right? With new players, right? New players, don't know, haven't played a million war games. It's a 3-hour game, right? How many, 3 hours in a traditional university classroom where you've got an hour, maybe an hour and a half, that's tough. That's hard to do. It becomes very time consuming. In a week, I'm going to spend a week on a war game. You don't have that kind of time in a traditional classroom. So I think time really is one of the biggest hindrances, which is why I come back to Kyleanne's comment, which is really and truly what we need is good war games which are playable in short periods of time, and they need to be, I would argue also that they need to be finished war games, right? Exportable war games that don't require a facilitator or an instructor to take out. Because one of the things that I think we also forget with all kinds of education, particularly with war games, is that repetition matters, right? You got to get reps in on if you really want to stick something into somebody's head, and you don't get reps if you only do something once. So it's really about how many times can we do this. So a game which I can walk out of the class, I can play in the classroom and then walk out and I want to go play it somewhere else. I want to play it with my buddies, my roommates at the at the Air Force Academy or wherever. That's a game that actually has a really strong possibility of teaching significantly, right? Doing it one time almost always creates that good experience, but I'm not sure that without the repetition, and that's really what games allow you to do, is to play it multiple times. You play chess a million times to figure out moves and to think patterns and all that sort of stuff. That's football players go out and play football. They do the same play over and over and over again. We run battle drills, assault drills, ambush drills over and over and over again. Why? Because that's how you learn. And you have to create games that people want to play, that are simple enough to play, and that there's a sort of almost a voluntary playability, I think, to get the most out of them. And I think that goes to another point that I saw pop up in one of the chat things, where it talks about, you got to kind of show that this is going to teach this better than any of these other traditional methods. And I agree, sort of sage on the stage, lecture, till they drop is clearly bad. But there are some really good lecturers out there. There's some people who really do a good job of doing lecture and discussion and getting the classroom involved in all sorts of other kinds of interactive activities that aren't games. So I think it's you kind of have to. It's not a one size fits all. It doesn't fit every situation. I think it fits a lot of situations. I am pro gaming. Don't get me wrong. I just think that there are some time, right? And does it do it better than sort of other methods? Right? Because it does require you to learn a whole new way of doing things. I think all that's important.
If I can add one thing onto that too, around games being, short and able to fit into a time, I think another thing we don't see enough of games that are flexible to be sort of picked up at different points throughout a course of instruction, whether it's a quarter or a semester, whatever it is, that sense. Often why we don't do it a lot is that there's this trepidation of, oh my God, this is going to take 3 hours to do. I can't give up an entire week's worth of courses to do something like this. Well, how can we as a community get more creative about, okay, no, actually, what if we played, a move a day for the entire semester? And so it becomes like 5 to 10 minutes a day. Like how can we work some of that in? That's something that, in working through the Wakanda game, it was, how do I make it so it actually doesn't hinder the contact hours I have for specific course things, that though they still do something every day, or not even every day. Sometimes there are some times where they'd go like 2 weeks without actually making a move because they had to learn something else first. And so I think one of the things too to that, as we think about designing games, how are we designing games that don't have to be played all at once or even in a linear fashion? What can we do, sort of thinking outside the box to help encourage people to do more, where it's like, oh yeah, today's the day that we do it, and then we do it again in 2 weeks, and it gets that excitement to almost bear through some of the nitty gritty that they've got to go through for class, and incentivize them to prep and learn.
So on that note, before we pivot away from this conversation of some of the obstacles like time and all other curricular constraints, is that I want to sort of ask all of you, what is one thing you guys would change about how war games are used in your institutions if you had unlimited power and unlimited money and all these things? So I'll cycle back to James first, and then we'll go around.
In a sense, the last thing you want to do is give the person in my position unlimited power. And the reason I say that, much though it would be, I would be utterly corrupted, but I might be theoretically happy. The problem is, I have time and time again seen that if you shove a game down an instructor's throat, they choke, and it does not work. Often if you walk into an instructor's classroom and tell them how they're going to teach, you could summarize their answer with a single finger. And in many ways, rightly so. Neither instructors nor students are a uniform standard product, and you need to tailor both to the other. And the students will bring their skills and knowledge, and the instructor needs to be flexible doing that. Which is why earlier I was saying the part of this is that we would need to know what it is they needed. If I could change one thing, two things, I guess, reach with a screwdriver into people's heads, then there are two things that I think I would do. And the first is that I would remove from the mindset of most people in the Army, at least, that wargame means the MDMP step, full stop. And to get them to realize that what they're doing is confusing. It's the old tale about the blind man with the elephant. They're confusing one part for the whole. And second, I would reach into their heads and switch off the association between game equals not serious and bad, and just erase that so that we could get past all of that and move on to, is this thing useful in your classroom? Because if it's useful in the classroom, it's good. And I don't care what you call it. If it's not useful in your classroom, it's bad.
No, that's great. And next, Chris.
Sure. So the first thing I do is I would check the chat out, and some of my colleagues from the Department of Strategic Wargames are in there adding some really, really good comments. And those are the guys who really do wargaming the best here at the War College. I mean, they are the all-stars, as everybody on this panel knows. And I've seen their games. They are sophisticated and excellent. I mean, it's just really phenomenal. It's phenomenal. I wander up there every once in a while just to sort of see what's going on and how they're working on it. So check their chat and check their comments out in the chat. They've got some good stuff over there. For me, at least, and again, it's not about how we do it at the War College, because I think that those, I'm going to leave that to them. They're the ones who sort of to speak to that. But for me, I think, and this comes back full circle to where we started. I'd like to see more. I don't want to say simple. Someone in the chat said elegant, and I think elegant is the right. It's the intersection between good game design and a learning objective, and that's actually a very small space, right? That's actually much tighter. You need a pretty tight shot group to hit that one, and that's really where I would like to see. And I'd like to see those games to be simple. Repeatable, sort of standalone. I'd like to see more cooperative gaming used in military war games, as opposed to sort of the competitive kind of war games that are more or less standard. I'd like to see more cooperative gaming. I think cooperative gaming has a huge potential to build teams. And again, more simple designs that are focused on sort of teaching one thing. So the one thing I've been working on recently is a game that's designed to teach the basics, a cooperative game that's designed to teach the basics of drone swarms, and how drone swarms, autonomous drone swarms, and how they sort of come at you, and how you might come up with different strategies for defeating those. And I think something that's the kind of, that just hyper focused on a single topic, I think is and simple and replayable a lot of times is, I think, really the direction I'd like to see more games go in.
Yeah,
I totally agree with you. And then Kai?
Yeah, I think building off of that, I think one of the things I'd like to see, and then I'll talk a little bit, we're sort of moving that way, is a movement like when we're talking about cooperative games, but really using war games beyond just, just the sense of going and destroying the enemy objective. I think there's a lot, two things. One, a lot we can learn about, especially the jointness. And again, I'm thinking sort of from a cadet perspective. I saw some about like undergrad, grad school, above, getting people out of their own little bubble that they get into here, that the end state, sort of winning the game, isn't necessarily destroying the target, but it is creating a operational plan that's truly joint and works, that sort of thing. I think also more use of wargaming to understand what sort of military we actually need, sort of flip some of this on its head. I think often we look at war games as, okay, we're going to take military professionals or students, as the case may be, and have them play out a scenario to understand a capability better. How does this capability work? Or to understand how a new operating concept might work, what that might be. But to use that to actually sort of flip it back, there's a lot of talk. The other sort of academic military thing that I'm very invested in is the gender, ethnic integration and diversity in the military. So how are we using games to actually understand the impact and power of diverse teams that we have there? how are we actually looking at the makeup of the group that we have playing, quote unquote, the game, to look at how, how do the characteristics of the individuals who are playing impact decision making, impact outcomes that we actually have. And I think, in a exciting sort of way that we're looking at doing this, at the Academy now, we have this great multi-domain lab that we're building. I know, Sebastian, we've talked about it, and I'm going to send you a long email about it coming up here shortly too, because many more exciting, advancements on that stage. But it's a big, the guy who runs it for us calls it the combat snow globe, because it starts with like the human domain of the big thing, like the people who are there, and then you can shake it up any way you want and throw any scenarios at him. I recently just got the whole thing IRB approved to actually study cadet outcomes in there. So how do cadet learning, how do the different teams that exist actually, make different decisions? Does it matter based on experience? We can look at prior enlisted versus not. We can look at, just different AFSCs that they end up in. So I think that's one of the things that I would like to see wargaming do more of as well. Not just look at, how are we driving sort of a linear outcomes, but what does it tell us about decision making? What does it tell us about the types of teams that we need to solve the complex problems that we are going to be facing in the future? And I think that's a really untapped place that the military hasn't looked at yet for these things.
So the one thing I will mention is I'm only a lot jealous that you're able to get IRB approval, because I would love to do experiments with games on my midshipmen, but apparently it is poo-pooed upon here. But I'm still trying to move that boulder up the hill. So only a wee bit jealous.
We'll work together to get it up there. Maybe I think it's just honestly because I tricked them into doing it. Because they don't even know what the whole MDL is yet.
So on that note, I would like to bring up a question that was thrown in by one of the audience. Is, can you talk about a little bit about what is it like to use wargaming and in your curriculum at your specific institutions? Because we have a very interesting array. Kai teaches, let's say, cadets in pajamas, right, at the Air Force Academy at the undergraduate level. Chris teaches at the War College level for the Army War College, and James teaches sort of at the graduate level at CGSC. So I would love to go around and see what are some of your unique things about your institution teaching at that level, at that field grade, right? And I'm sure all of you guys have unique insights. So James, I'll let you kick it off.
I think you may find that we've got more overlap than not, because depending on what we're looking at, CGSC instruction in particular can go down sometimes to looking below the battalion level. If you're running a battalion, you probably want to see, by default, we assume you want to see 2 levels down. Now you're running companies, and that's looking pretty tactical. At the upper end, I'm not sure that it's the highest level echelon we've run a game for, but we've got a thing on computer called Future Force. You could buy it from HPS Sims, which is at the national strategic level. You've got blue versus orange. It's a 20-year-long game, and every year your key decisions are allocating your budget to build the force in order to compete against the other nation. And that was built to be a introduction to the force management block of instruction, which most of these students hated because it was dry, but they liked that. And the focus typically, at least for CGSC, is on divisions. For SAMs, it's up a level at core and theater. But even then, it will vary depending on the lesson and what they're looking at that day. So the other thing that I think you'll find is probably, I'm predicting ahead of the other two speaking here, probably similar, is the vast majority of students are not gamers. I've been a gamer since 3rd grade in 1977. And to me, some of the games that we use with students are ridiculously simple in their rules. We don't want them ridiculously simple in the decision space. As Chris was picking up, elegance is really the key here. But that means that we have to find things that are that simple and elegant thing, so that a new player, a non-gamer, can manage to pick the game up and play it effectively, so that they get past fighting the game, they get to fighting their opponent or struggling with the problem, whatever it might be, and still get at whatever it is we need them to be getting at.
That's great. So Chris?
James hit the nail right on the head. I've used games at the undergraduate and the graduate, and now here at the War College. And the biggest thing is most people aren't gamers, right? So you really have you have a different maturity level, different ability to sort of engage on things that they're not immensely interested in immediately, and that's what maturity brings you. So that's a good thing. But other than that, you see some of the same problems at all three levels. And so, for example, I was allowed, because I can't believe they don't let you use students in IRB approved experiments. But anyway, I did get to do a lot of that, and I ran a lot of experiments on this, and I was very surprised to find that students, for example, I used to use 2 games a week, simple games, easy games, right? Not hard. We're not talking rocket science kind of games. 2 games a week in my strategic intelligence class that I taught to undergraduates and graduates. The complaints about how many games they had to play and how many sets of rules they had to learn was really a shocker to me the first time I heard it, because I've been a gamer all my life, picking up, playing 2-3 different games. I do that in a night, right? You go to some games cafe on a weekend, you'll play 3 different games, right? No. They just don't have the context to put all that in. And even if they consider themselves gamers, it's typically with a very finite kind of game, like first-person shooters and typically video games, not tabletop. So that is a huge thing. So I think we talk about sort of the elegance of the game design, and we talk about sort of the learning objectives, and the intersection of that is tight. Now on top of that, you add one more circle to your Venn diagram, and that is the student's preferences when it comes to games, right? So some students don't like medieval themed games, right? Some students don't like strategic kinds of games. Some students don't like card games, whatever, right? There's a layer, and you run the risk of losing them, not because the game design's not elegant and not because it doesn't hit the learning objective, because the student just doesn't like that kind of game. And I think that's even a tighter shot group to hit.
And Kai?
Yeah, I think you're pulling off of that, not liking some of the games, not understanding it. I think there's some teaching at the undergrad level in particular, some generational differences. If you bring out a tabletop game, which we have done, and actually we work a lot with our cadet wing in using it for leadership building activities, between the classes within a squadron, how you can set up, who's sort of the national level commander down to your company commands in some of these games. You bring out a tabletop game and you get some funny looks just from generational differences, where I think all of us, not to assume anyone's age, but I think we all grew up playing board games of some sort as kids, and it's normal to us. I think there is this disconnect at first of not even not liking, but not fully understanding how to engage with something that's on a table, or with a deck of cards, or with a hex die. Like, getting them actually into that physical space is an initial challenge. And I think that's a big generational thing. And I think that's where what we have found successful here is we have to have at least some online component. And if we bring in some online, even if the whole game isn't online, even if it's the way I ended up working it with the Wakanda game is we posted video updates from Wakanda, which is where I recruited my fellow faculty here, and is actually some of my Georgetown grad students too, to actually record videos as if they were reporting from the field out there, and sending them out to my team, out to my cadets via Teams and via Snapchat and via using those digital platforms to provide them information they needed for a physical game, bridge that gap. And now I have found a lot of them love tabletop type games. Actually love some of that, needing that physical space in it. So I think the biggest thing I have grappled with here is really that generational disconnect. That getting them excited about something that is on paper was tough at first, but it's there. I think the other is at the service academies in particular, is when we look at cadets, I think, again, a misconception is that they're fully immersed in the military jargon world understanding all of that. And I think one of the pitfalls that instructors who have tried to, and this also kind of loops back thinking about that, why don't we do it as much? Pitfalls that instructors come up with is that they bring in games, whether they're medieval games, World War II games, and they assume that cadets know basic military terminology and get very frustrated. And then the cadets get frustrated because we forget, again, they are 20-year-olds in cool pajamas. They don't know. Most of them have never been in the military. You have some that are prior enlisted, but most of them who are priors are E3s, maybe E4s, so they're not engrossed in the language. And I think that's something that at the undergraduate level, regardless, and whether or not you're at an academy, I think it's really important to remember when you're at the undergraduate level that basic terms, even if you just talk about like a battalion landing team, if you bring a game out, they're like, what's a battalion? They have no sense of the scale, the size, how long that would take to move. Or you bring things like a game and you're like, oh yeah, we have a carrier strike group over here. You may as well tell them that like Mickey Mouse is hanging out in the water, so you have to, I think the biggest challenge is making sure to bring things down to a very, very, very basic level of this understanding of like, why can't I just pick up the entire carrier strike group and move over there in one move? You're like, well, no, because it's going to take like 3 weeks for it to get across the ocean. And they're like, what? So really remembering that this isn't innate, it isn't ingrained. And so some of the quote unquote rules need to be, I think, explained a little bit better, just in terms of what even the players are.
That is a fantastic point, because I literally learned that this semester teaching at the Naval Academy, as you see on the wall. And one of my students, I was writing some NATO symbols for counters. We were having a lecture on counter design, and I was using NATO symbols. And one of my students raises his hand and goes, "What is that?" And I'm like, "That's a mechanized infantry unit, obviously." You know what I mean? At a company, obviously. And he's like, "I don't know what that is." And you know what I mean? I was like, "Well, okay," right? And I found out something very similar when I tried to run a tactical decision game with them, and they didn't understand the terms in the decision game, right? So it was hard for them to decipher some of those things. So that is something I also learned teaching at the undergraduate level for the first time this spring semester. I wish I spoke to you last fall. So on that note, this past year has been incredibly chaotic and demanding as educators, as we have gone to the virtual learning environment, hybrid learning environment, and who knows next year and what the next semester brings. So one of the things I wanted to ask all of you is, what have you learned? What are some lessons learned? What are ways you adapted during the virtual learning environment, teaching in this environment? And we'll start off with Chris this time.
You had to start off with me. I probably have the fewest lessons learned on this. Online game platforms have come a long way. There's a whole bunch of resources out there. Everybody on this panel and everybody who's listening to this is almost certainly aware of all of those and how you use those. I saw somebody mention in the chat how this generation is much more comfortable doing these kinds of things, and has been well before the pandemic, doing these games of all kinds online. My sons play online constantly, and they play with Discord and with other tools to help them play. Everything from League of Legends to Dungeons and Dragons to whatever games that happen to be played. So I think there is a big generational comfort with this style of teaching and this style of gameplay. For me, I'll tell you, it's just hard, and that's just me being an old codger. I need to be around the table, and I got to hold the dice. That's just sort of my style. So I'm not sure I'm the best person to learn, but it is obvious that there's a generation coming that is well prepared for both the tabletop experience. Somebody I noticed was talking about game cafes and sort of the resurgence of game cafes. And once we're able to go out to cafes again, we'll all be, at game cafes, hopefully. But also this sort of online gameplay that's happening very, very widely across a broad range of the gaming industry. So I think that it all bids well for the future of online gaming.
Opening a game cafe sounds like my dream job, Chris. So you'll be invited to come down to whenever I open that up. James, what about you? How has CGSC and your wargaming department adapted to the virtual environment?
With a great deal of work. I'm going to post a link in chat because the longer version of this, I wrote up what we learned as of last spring for Rex Brynon's PackSims website. But a lot of the upshots are it is harder and slower than running the games in person. Everything is harder. You can't run multiple games as you can sort of in person. If it's a simple game, I can wander between a couple tables. I can look at each table and I can sort of get a quick sense of how things are going on. That's impossible online. You need to keep your tools simple. One of the big surprises for us was that some of the slick, nice online tools, things like Tabletopia and Tabletop Simulator, did not go down well with students. Not least because they became technologically challenged. And one person in a group being technologically challenged tends to bring the rest of the group to a halt unless you have even more manpower in order to take that person aside and have somebody work one-on-one with them to fix it. A particular rub point we hit there, Race to the Rhine, which is a brilliant game focused on logistics, has what looked to us like a really slick, well done, well thought through implementation on Tabletopia. And I'll stand by that. If you've got enough computing power and enough computer awareness, it's really nicely done. And then we had people who had trouble figuring out the interface on that. It crashed people's computers because their internet connections weren't good enough, so on and so forth. So you get a lot of tech problems that you otherwise avoid. We found that people needed more and bigger screens. We had one student who was challenged because she had a perfectly capable piece of hardware. She was working on a relatively recent Surface laptop, but the screen's minuscule, so she's viewing the thing through a soda straw. It requires more student prep. It requires more people. CGSC fundamentally is moving back to largely in-person learning as far as I can tell. So I'm not sure how much of the online is going to stick around. What I'm hoping is that we can leverage the lessons of how to run things online so that our brown bag wargaming program, the optional after-hours wargaming that we do with students, can become more frequently more global. So one of the things we are toying with is that in the coming year, when we expect to be fully live, we'll run half the brown bag events live in person, and we will try to run half of them online so that the rest of the world has a chance to join in.
So I highly recommend everyone to read James's article in PackSims. It was really insightful for myself as an educator and as someone who teaches game design. And Kai?
There we go. We talk about tech. We should all be good at mute buttons by now, right? But somehow they still screw us up from time to time. So we were fortunate here that we were in a bit of a unique situation in that we were allowed to stay somewhat hybrid throughout all of this, where we had much smaller groups than we normally would have, but small groups in person from time to time. And so what I found as worked really well is that when I couldn't, be in person with my cadets, I had them go play a game together somewhere else, and then we'd swap and have the other half go work on the game while I met with another half in person, if that makes sense. So basically, what we had to do here was cut our classes in half. We normally have about 20 cadets at a time. We were down to we couldn't have more than 10 in a classroom with us at any given point for social distancing, masked up. So I would take 10 and do more of a traditional lecture discussion, have another 10. And this required, I'm pretty sure the registrar hated me for a while because I was scheduling 2 classrooms at a time for work. But you had the other 10 go, do work on the game together. And then the next class period, they'd swap. And so it created this, when we talk about how you integrate it in, like you learn, apply. And then also talking about how it should teach us more about how cadets work. Basically, they would only get half the information at a time and have to play off of the other half of their team's moves. And so it forced them to communicate better through, and again, this is where technology in this generation works very well. I set up Teams channels for each of their groups where they could communicate as much about their thought process with the moves that they made, their decision making, their justification for why they did what they did. And so that's how I ended up working it here with smaller groups. I'm actually, now that we're going back to like normal class sizes, I was like, how am I going to do this now? Because it worked out very well when I forced half of them had to be forced there. And a big reason why I really advocated to do it this way was because some of the things that James had brought up. The cadets are constrained by just bandwidth in terms of what they have from a computer perspective, both in fact that Wi-Fi is rough here, and they're on how do am I frozen?
Oh, I think we got you back.
See, that's what I was talking about, our bad Wi-Fi here, that we can't run big games on, can't even finish the the panel. It's there looking for me there, right? But yeah, so because of that, tried to really work a hybrid scenario where I could get that hands-on learning as much as I could there. And I'm really looking at, now that we're at a return back to normal, how we're going to work that in, how we can use now our new big multi-domain lab to have some of those sort of team-on-team information deficit situations as well.
Yeah, that's great. I think Big Brother is watching you at the Air Force Academy. The IT folks heard you were bad mouthing their Wi-Fi, and they're like, "We'll just cut her off, and we'll teach Kai who's boss." I think some of the questions in the chat are really interesting in the sense of, how is it that you balance the time of using games during class time, but also setting up other opportunities outside the classroom to do wargaming or wargaming education? So we will start with James this time.
I'm sorry, I got distracted by Paul Weber on the Discord. Could you repeat the question?
Yeah. So Paul, stop distracting my panelists. Two is how do you balance, or how do you offer, what kind of opportunities do you offer for both games inside the classroom during the curriculum, but also, like you said, outside and beyond the classroom at your institution, so like your brown bags. How do you balance those? How do you coordinate those things, and so forth?
So the key in many ways for our brown bags is that I own one room. And because I own a room, I don't have to fight to schedule it, which means that I can schedule things in it when I wish. And if you don't have that luxury, if you don't have the ability to say, it will happen here, you're going to be already fighting an uphill battle. But because I've got that room, the second question is, how often do we run them? And the balance there is partly student time, and it is partly our time. Running a brown bag, at least the way we do it, requires an investment up front, because the public events, we split our brown bags into public and experimental events. I guess I should start at the beginning. Experimental events could be, Mike and James are going to run this thing, and we're going to be learning it. And if you would like to come in and learn it with us, then you're welcome. And some of those are scheduled purely for our convenience, and we let people know in case they're free to drop by. Some of them are scheduled for more people's convenience. The ones that are scheduled for student convenience begins with the student schedule. So we're looking for typically free Friday afternoons on the CGSC schedule that hopefully won't get overwritten when the schedule gets shifted about, which it frequently does. Then if it's going to be this public event, because we've advertised it to all the students and everybody on the mailing list, then we have to be ready to teach it to people who are not gamers, which means that you have you've not only learned the game, you have built a teaching script, you've chosen the scenario, you've potentially made some quick rules modifications that you're going to deal with. You have murder boarded the teaching script. Mike and I will test fire those with each other and get pretty brutal in the critique. You said the wrong word right here. You had this out of order. You need to reorder this. We're going to need slide support here, all that sort of stuff, so that when people come in, it will be a smooth experience. That typically takes, several days at some point leading up. Doesn't necessarily have to be just the days leading up. So the upshot to that is typically we find we can run about 2 of those a month, or we run out of time and it eats too much out of the other things that we're trying to get done. The time that it actually executes, we typically can't get people for more than 3 hours if we expect a large group. If there are days in this schedule, which often occur once or twice a semester, that nothing is happening on that Friday, often it's the day of a long weekend, something like that, we will choose those days to run a more complex game because that will run all day, because we expect that only the dedicated will show up to it, or the people who are really interested in the topic. And if they're willing to commit all day, we can run something more complicated and bigger. So hopefully that sort of answers things.
So that's great. There are a couple things I took note of that I want to circle back with you later, but Chris, I hand it over to you.
So I'm going to use my time to riff off of something that James said, and that's talking about time. And all of our curricula, I suspect, and I can't imagine, I think we'll all agree, is we're trying to put 10 pounds of potatoes into a 5-pound sack. These students have a million things they've got to do in addition to whatever it is that we're asking them to do, and trying to layer more stuff on top of that is a real challenge. And I think that one of the ways around that, and this is my riff, is something that I've been playing around with for years, and I'll pass it on for what it's worth. I call it the Game Genome Project, and I do that deliberately because a number of years ago there was a music genome project. And what they did was they took a look at music. They said genres of music like rock and country, they don't work very well. So we really want to be a lot more granular in looking at music and looking at people's preferences for music. And so they looked at beats per minute, whether it was a female singer, whether it was a male singer, did a whole bunch of that sort of analysis. And what they were able to do was say, here are songs in different genres that have elements which we reliably can figure out that people like. And so we're able to now suggest songs from different genres to people with some realization that they might in fact actually like that song because it matches their preferences. It matches what their preferences are. In other words, you don't like a country song. You like a high tempo female lead singer country song or song. That's what you really like. It's not the country part. It's those other parts that you like. And those exist in a lot of different genres. That project, the Music Genome Project, turned into the Pandora Music Service. I think we need something like that for games, where we look at what is the game, how well designed is the game, how is the game designed, what are the elements of the game, what are the possible learning objectives that could come out of that game. In other words, what does that game teach, arguably, right? And then somehow connect that to player preferences. If you had a game genome project where I could say, look, I know you need to learn this. I know these games teach it, and this game matches your player preferences, we would have a very powerful tool for optimizing the little bit of time that students have. So rather than asking them to play something which we might like, or even a lot of people might like, but they don't like, in which case they will not learn what we want them to learn because they hate the experience so much, we would be able to optimize what little time that we have. So riff/rant over, think about the Game Genome Project.
Chris, I think that is $1 billion industry if you get that right. Because there are many times, even for me, who is a gamer, right? There's games that are recommended to me. I'm like, this is not exactly what I want, right? And sometimes it's about game dynamics. Sometimes it's about aesthetics, right? Personally, I'm always a sucker for miniatures. If a game has really nice miniatures, I will most likely buy it, much to my detriment. But Kai, I hand it over to you.
Yeah, I mean, I will buy it just for the miniatures. I mean, I've got, you can't see them on the screen here. Just to, even if I never play the game, I'm like, oh, but they look cool. There. When we talk about other ways, that we engage, one of the things that a small group of us here who have, who are cross-discipline, who have become more and more involved in wargaming, are looking to do is to really build a cadet leadership cadre that can run, primarily of seniors, firsties here, as we call them, who can go run these in their squadron. Because I'd say particularly, this is one of the things maybe more on how we've actually adapted to the COVID. We've all been here, but cadets haven't been allowed to leave. That's just one of the realities of it, is they've built this sort of bubble for us to live in here. But because of that, there's actually been a bigger interest in games, and in actually building out games that are going to take longer to play. It started as a group of seniors being like, I need something to do with my freshmen that are stuck here, and I've been told here you go, you've got them for 6 hours this weekend to do leadership stuff, and they're not given a good definition of what that is. So this has provided an opportunity to really create a cadre, to understand what wargaming is and how it can be used in a variety of different ways. I think what's been exciting about this here is that so often military officers aren't exposed to war games until they get to command and staff level school. Sometimes at EWS, sometimes at the captain level, but mostly at major and above levels when they first really get exposed to games. So how do we at least get them thinking that this is a framework that they can use when they get out into the operating forces? In non-COVID times, it would have been much more daunting, I think, because the cadets' time is just so overloaded. And in non-COVID world, the last thing they want to do on a Friday is stick around the academy. You're just in the reality. They're like, we're gone. How can we get away from here? But it's given this opportunity to create a whole new generation of it. And we're working on a nice little chapter for your book on this one, Sebastian. We'll give another plug there for the book coming up on how to encourage it and build just thinking about war games in pre-commissioning education. And even if they don't become an expert and they're not designing their own games yet, and they're not that far down sort of this rabbit hole, they're thinking that, hey, this is a tool that I can use to build unit cohesion. It's a way I can, kind of welcome new people into my unit. Because you start to build. I think what's encouraging is when we talk about learning objectives. Chris mentioned earlier, what is the objective? Sometimes the objective is just getting them to gel as a unit, getting them to actually solve a problem together. And it's a simple way to do it. And this is where games have spun that aren't even military games anymore, that are in more of the fantasy realm of games that you're seeing played more and more, because it builds a community. And seeing that side of things come up has been really exciting.
So one of the things I want to pivot from that comment is to think about what we as instructors, as war game designers, as war gamers can do moving forward to advance our field in terms of education and gaming and wargaming education. As an example I will give is that one of the things is a pet project of mine that I've just recently started but always wanted to do is create a repository of educational games, right? So Kai can upload her documents for Wakanda, and Chris tells me the games that he has used, Showdown, right? And James gets to upload Landfire, which he did for me, and so that if someone else at the Air University or at the Marine Corps War College wants to use these games, they can look up games and be like, hey, sort of this is what this game does, right? Similar to Chris's idea of the War Game Genome Project, but mine's a little bit different, more as a library of games and how educators have used them in the past. And I'd love to pick your brains individually about something that you guys think that we as a community can do to sort of advance the ball for educational gaming. So, James, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I've been thinking about an answer on this while you've been asking the question, and I'm slightly flailing. So part of it is things like connections, right? Because we all trade off, whether it's in the chat or in the actual live hallway or whatever. We're trading things together. But the wider piece of that, at least from my particular foxhole, goes back to a thing that Bill Haggart taught me as a means of looking at how you achieve organizational change. And I gather there's some other more widely known set of acronym for this, but the one he told me was SPISH, and I'll put it into the chat, which is for Scouts, Pioneers, Settlers, and Hermits. And the Scouts are about 5% of your population, and they're the ones who want something that is new and fresh and exciting, and they don't necessarily even care if it works. They're the Magpies. They're always having new ideas. There's one of the people who we support. The joke is that he doesn't get mugged by the Good Idea Fairy. He takes the Good Idea Fairy out to candlelit dinners hoping to get lucky. And he's awesome to talk to because there are new ideas spalling out of his brain at a mile a minute. Nailing him down long enough to execute them can sometimes be a real challenge because he's on to the next idea before you manage to execute the first one. But it's great to talk to these people because they're always pouring out ideas. Then you get the pioneers, who are the ones who see the things that the Scouts have found, and they care much more about, does this work? How do I turn this into a practical application? And again, this is a small chunk of the body of people, and you're finding that these people will less self-identify. The Scouts come by to you because they're looking to see if you got something new. The pioneers, you sort of have to find a bit more, but when you find them, I want to support them to the hilt. Do absolutely everything I can to make them look like heroes, make their project work. Because if they make it work, they codify it, and the settlers, who are the vast majority of the population, will say, oh, you've figured it out. Here's the lesson plan. Here's the how-to. You've made the slides. All the work, so to speak, of the preparation has been done so that they only have to do the work of their personal preparation, which is still work, and they will tend to follow along. And then you've got the hermits, who at one point I called the haters, but I got corrected by Bill on this because I was saying, well, they're just the ones who don't want anything new. And he pointed out, and it's a good point, that they are often Scouts and pioneers who are burned out by incessant fights with the administration or the naysayers or the friction. And they're toast now. They don't want to do anything more. And what you do is you listen to them to understand the obstacles that you're going to have to overcome as well, so you get a better sense of how to go through it. So we're always looking for that transition from the Scouts have found something or we have found something to pioneers who will put it into practice so that we can make it widespread. One of the big challenges in moving it from pioneer to settler for us is the pioneer means that it is a small group, which means that I can take me and my team and I can put one or more people in the classroom. So if we're supporting Kyleanne in her classroom, I can put 2 people there because it's the only event occurring. But now when it's all 3 of you suddenly, or 24 of you, however many it might be, suddenly I can't put 1 person in every classroom. And now there's a higher administrative and train up overhead in which I have to make sure that all the instructors know the game well enough, that they have brought in and selected and given to me enough students, that I have trained up the students so that all of them know the game well enough that then we can backstop the students so that it runs at a larger scale. So the scaling step is often not smooth, but it's one of the things we've got to overcome.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think we should go back later a little bit about how you guys move from pioneers to settlers. I think that'll be a great conversation later on in the hour. But Chris, what about you? What should we be doing to advance the field of educational gaming?
Well, thanks for giving me the opportunity to beat my drum one more time, and that is simple games that cover discrete learning objectives that are playable within the context of a traditional block of instruction, whatever that means for you and your institution. For a lot of us, that's an hour, maybe 2 hours. I really think that that's and to get those games out, maybe into your repository, if not your repository, on the Board Game Geek. So get them somewhere where people can test them and play them and use them. I guarantee that if we can get a bunch of really good sort of current themed, right? So not necessarily historical, but current themed games that are relatively easy to play and help make some of these concepts about future warfare more comprehensible. If we can get those into people's hands, you will see people immediately start to see the value in it. But it's got to be simple enough for people to pick it up and do something with it. It can't be so complicated that it takes facilitators and an hour on watching YouTube videos to be able to play. It's got to be simpler than that.
Chris, you are speaking my language. I think there is a whole market for educational games for teachers, for specific institutions, for specific contexts that has largely been ignored in the wargaming community. So you and I will jump on that soapbox together and yell on the corner of the street. And Kai?
Well, I'll jump right up there with you, because I think that's one of the things that, I think what we can do as a community is simple, but I would say also, I don't like the term low level, but I don't know what else to put it, because it's not necessarily complex tactical, but simple and introductory games. I think there's a sort of a bar that, and it's been unconscious, I think that's been said. I don't think there was ever any malicious intent with it, but this sense that, okay, well, you have to, even just the things, that Sebastian, you and I have gathered from working with, cadets and mids, this sense that there are things that they just don't know. So I think games that are simple, but also have a real low barrier to entry. And maybe that's just having more basic and robust instruction guides that come with some of our games, like not everyone knows the NATO symbols. Let's make sure that's a key. And that's something like with the repository, maybe we have a sort of standard glossary for things that are there. Because I think one of the biggest barriers that often exists is that, you have faculty or instructors that might be wary because they don't know either. And I think that's often if you bring people in, I think there are great applications for these games in just about any discipline that's out there. So let's keep the barrier to entry to them super low. Let's not need a super secret decoder ring to have to play just to understand the language that's in the instructions for the games. Because I think that's where I have seen cadets who have started super interested pick up something and they're like, I don't know what a battalion landing team is. Off, can't do the game, can't even deal with it. I don't know what this symbol means. I'm automatically put off. So I think to really encourage a diversity of people getting in there, like we've got a really good opportunity to say, hey, let's make it easy. Let's just make it easy for people to get excited and want to play. And I think that starts with, to Chris's point, simple, elegant games that are easy to play, but instructions that are easy to understand. And and as the DoD, we are the worst at this. We are like alphabet soup acronym city when it comes to how we even just talk. So I think that's, if we're very intentional about it, we can do a lot of good.
These are all great ideas. And one thing I do want to go back to is James's comment about how do we get, as many of us on this panel are pioneers or scouts or trying to push gaming in our respective institutions. How do we get people to shift from that stage of pioneers to settlers when, and I would love to pick James's head on that. So James?
You have to make the pioneer look like a hero. That really, there is no more important thing. You have to make that event a success, because if it fails, you're dead in the water. You're not going to get any further forward. But you have to make it look like a hero in such a way that other people notice. And that can be a challenge, because the most powerful forms of serendipity there are things you can't control. I can't control when Sebastian is going to visit Chris's classroom and happen to see that something is going on that's really good. I can't control when you're going to have a meeting in the coffee or around the water cooler or whatever it might be. One of the things that supercharged the use of land power is that in its pilot year 2 years ago, and COVID has really gotten in the way of using it for the most recent 2 years, unfortunately, as the instructors filed out of a room that was using land power while on a break, and there were at least 12 students apparently still in the room. As they were filing out, they run into a 3-star general who has come down to see what's going on. And the 3-star general says, "What's going on?" And they say, "Oh, we're on a 15-minute break." And the 3-star walks into the room and sees a dozen students clustered around the table arguing about the situation on the map. When 3-star says, "This is awesome, we should do it." Now, there's danger in that because, again, this now means it's being shoved down from above, and therefore some people choke on it. But that's the sort of thing you can't organize. What you can do is you try to make sure that two things that I kind of mentioned before. One, they do very well within the limits of your ability to make that happen. And two, that you think with them as they prepare to roll it out wider, if that happens, what is the change in the level of support needed? Because if we've got typically around 20 sections of 64 students, which are broken into groups, staff groups of 16. If it works in one group of 16, what's the support level necessary to line up to be able to do it for another 60 or 80 of these groups? And that's a qualitative change in the amount of support for the rollout. The other thing that you've got to be able to do is keep it as simple as possible, keep it locked in as tightly as possible on the objectives so that it's easy to make that case. You don't want to have any flubs, any difficulty in explaining to the uncertain, hey, this is why it's going to drive the learning that you need.
No, that's great. And there are many things, and there are many times I have picked James's brain personally offline on how to grow GUWS from moving from that pioneer to the settler portion. But Chris, do you have a comment?
Yeah, I was just going to say, one of the things I learned is sort of teaching with games and sort of trying to codify and capture that data was that games-based learning is plural, right? And what I mean by that is that you have to have multiple games that can teach the same sort of objective. And so in the context of going from pioneers to settlers, I think I keep coming back to this, you need to have multiple games which are so good, right, that people want to play them, right? That people want, and I think within the context of the wargaming, particularly the military wargaming, right? So the kind of stuff we're doing, that means that people have to see, and particularly among adult learners, they have to see value in what they're doing. In other words, the execution of this, the time to the return on my investment in terms of my very, very small amount of time has to be pretty high. That's actually a really hard game to design. That's a bear to design, but that should be the target of what we're doing. It's not more, in my mind, it's not more gaming. It's better gaming. It's gaming that people go, wow, I got a lot out of that in the short amount of time that I put into it. If you can do that, then I think people are going to be more ready for 2, 3, 4 a week worth of whatever kind of gaming that comes along, because the value, they've been sold on the value proposition. But until you can start selling a lot more people, and I mean a lot more people on the value proposition, I think it's going to be very, very challenging.
So Kai, do you have any comments on that?
I've been, musing on that one, and I think some though is this sense at some of the institutions of how do we get people aware of what we're doing here, sort of in the first place. I think a lot of where one of the challenges that I see, and I think I agree, and as James has been talking, my wheels are turning. I think we're all struggling from that a little bit. Like when we hear someone talk, then we're like, wait a minute, okay, let me ruminate on where we can go. But I think some is how to get that first step, to get the right people even aware of what's going on, is I think one of the challenges that especially some of our younger cadets, younger officers, younger folks, younger students actually see. Yeah, I mean, even to James' point in the chat here, like faculty doesn't even know we exist. How do we showcase it is one of the things that I'm looking that I'm sort of struggling with here, to even get to that step of, we're in a place where we're doing a lot of good, and I think there's a lot of goodness that's happening in a lot of different areas, which is why even conferences or discussions like this are so important. But how do we how do we get our own institutions? And James, I'm going to kick this one to you because you're my wise mentor here now, that whether you like it or not, like, how do you how do you publicize? Because I think that's where I still, like when we look at this whole, to get people to become settlers, like, well, how do we publicize that we've got scouts out there to begin with?
James?
Not always my forte, sadly. I am bad at the advertising thing, but I have been fortunate that I often have a boss who is good at it. So the structure we have is that usually there's an FA-57, the simulation operations field in the Army, lieutenant colonel who is the boss of directorate of simulation education. And often they are much better salespeople than I am. The weird thing that we found is that and as you noted, I'd noted in the internal chat that one of our challenges is that after 20 years here, there's some people that don't know our little directorate exists. Oh, you're here? You're here to do that? Really? We get that periodically. And I'll cycle back to the boss thing in a minute. There's two populations of instructors. There are the civilian instructors, and there are the military instructors. And the military instructors are typically here for 2 to 3 years. And they spend the first year, in effect, learning how to be an instructor. They're brand new to it. They got assigned there. They may or may not have any particular aptitude for teaching. They may or may not actually have wanted to be sent to CGSC. And some of them are brilliant. Some of them are resentful. And you get the whole spectrum of that. All of them, inevitably, they want to have their top block, so they charge in and they try to do a good job. So the civilians often have a better knowledge that we're here than they do, simply because of that cycling through. So the bizarre thing that I found is that often, if you're talking to people in uniform, you want to have somebody in uniform. If you're talking to the civilians, you want to have a civilian. And I really had not expected that. But there are times when we are very much wanting to deploy the leaf power of my boss. And there are times when it's better if he's not in sight. That said, often simply because he's lieutenant colonel and he's got director in front of his name, he is better placed to make the sale. The other thing that we try to do is we put out posters about things like brown bag. We post that all over the place. We will go out and we'll put one on every bulletin board. The challenge, of course, is bulletin board fatigue. How many of you walk past your organizational bulletin board and actually stop to read anything on it? And I can see the forest of hands coming up from here. Yeah, even with the video off, I don't need, yeah. So communication is the issue. And at times we have had the ability to put announcements about our events into the CGSC newsletter or something like that. But equally, when they allow peons like us to put things in that organizational newsletter, it means all the other people who've got something to show off for good reason also want to put their thing in the newsletter, at which point, much like the bulletin board, it gets drowned. So for better or worse, the key method turns out to be word of mouth. And it's not necessarily the most effective, but that's the thing that seems to get us the farthest.
Yeah, I mean, we have a similar, I think, the one of the challenges, I think, at our institution, we have a similar model where we have military faculty who are brought in for anywhere between 1 to 3 years, who often get put in more senior-ish positions because of their rank, and then civilian faculties who are sort of that longevity side of the of the house. And so how getting some of ours noticed, because I think that's one of their, sort of as a community, where a lot of, I think, our work can do is to help help socialize it at other institutions that are similar or might be interested in it, to help move some of this along forward, and have our little, like, civilian cabal network here that we can that we can build.
Chris, do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, and I don't mean to be a contrarian again, but I've been going to wargaming conferences for 50 years, and we keep saying pretty much the same thing at every conference about these problems, right? These problems continue to exist. And I think until we have a Settlers of Catan, that's a war game. And the only one I can think of even close is maybe Axis and Allies. It's gonna be really hard to get pioneers to become settlers. I think you need to have a game that people want to play, and they want to play more than once. And I think actually the community could design one but it's going to be hard. That's a hard thing to do. But I feel until we have that kind of game and can create that kind of experience that people want to do it on their own and do it on their own time, we're going to continue to struggle they're going to always be pioneers. I think you're going to struggle to get settlers.
So Chris always hits on the head in the sense that I also agree that we need educational games that are easy and accessible, that are built for our purposes, for our particular institutions or a wider audience, right? You know what I mean? Something that is easy and accessible for our teaching purposes. And those are not always analytical games that DoD always designs. On that note, I will like to pivot everyone, because I am the moderator, onto a soapbox that I jump on all the time, is how do we get educational gaming and games for training out to the operating forces? So all of us teach at various institutions, usually like civilian or PME institutions, the War College, Command General Staff College. I teach at Georgetown, and Kai teaches at the U.S. Air Force Academy, right? But how do we get our gaming efforts, right, out into the brigades and the battalions and the fleets? So I would love to open that up. So Kai, do you want to go first? You seem like you're about to jump out of your chair.
Yes, I can. I am happy to go first, and I think this is where getting out of our institutions is so important. Things I look at, like the Krulak Center at Marine Corps University, that has a really good non-resident fellow program in terms of being able to push things into the hands of folks who are going to go be battalion commanders sometime soon. That's important. So I think those relationships are super important. I think this is where some of the benefit of having this rotating, revolving door of military faculty coming through our institutions is so important, because like we have a Navy guy who's here right now who's about getting ready to leave, and I am like shoving all of this stuff at him. I'm like, okay, now you're heading back to the boat. Here's everything you got to take, with you to go. But I think one of the biggest things is, encouraging our leadership to encourage us to be plugged into these non-resident fellowship places, these utilizing our our faculty that are going to be rotating into the other forces and the like.
James, do you have a comment?
As always, right? So on the one hand, this is something that we've been discussing with our colleagues at the Army Model and Simulation Office, in particular, a guy by the name of Jeff Hodges. And one of the mantras that we've been batting around and seeing what we can do with is create an army of wargamers. We know that historically, forces that wargame well and wargame extensively have a track record of tending to win. Whether you're looking at the Prussians and the Wars of Unification, or you're looking at the U.S. Navy with Nimitz famously pointing back at the wargaming at the Naval War College as being a key to the victory over the Japanese in the largest naval war in history. So we think that we should somehow be able to spread that. And there's a couple different lines of effort. One of which is we're looking at trying to bring in the UK's Fight Club to the US, trying to encourage people to spend time playing war games on their spare time. And there's a layer at which we don't care what the war game is. You're playing Warhammer 40K. I don't care. And in fact, in a sense, I really do care. That's a great thing to play. I learned this in particular, not having been a Warhammer fan at any point. A student of mine 2 years ago, Major Andrew Powell, Red Powell, is the captain of the Army's Warhammer 40K esports team. And he's apparently one of the best Warhammer 40 players in either the US or the world. I don't remember the details. But what's important is when you get him talking about either how he's going to win in his next Warhammer tournament, or how he's going to win in some other game or exercise or in the field. You find it's very much the same skill set he's bringing to bear, that it's this deep and instinctive, because sometimes you're getting him on the fly with it, analysis of what are my strengths and my mission and their weaknesses. How do I apply my strength at their weakness while warding off their strengths in order to achieve victory? And if we could have a force that did that instinctively, that would be awesome. So if we can simply spread a culture of hobby wargaming, I don't care whether or not it's 40K, because that's the sort of thing that the people are sitting there and being po-faced about it and say, wow, that's not modern, it's not relevant. But the thought behind it is, then that would be really a great thing. One of the things that occurred back in the 1990s is that the Marine Corps Commandant put out, I don't remember the exact title, but it was essentially the Marine Corps Wargame list, complete with explicit permission to play games that were on that list on duty time, on duty computers, because, assuming it didn't interfere with the rest of your job, because it was useful professional development. And it's that kind of encouragement from the top that I think would be the thing the top could do that would be useful. To give a wide list, not you will play this thing at this time, but hey, when you've got spare time, you are encouraged to take your pick off this list in order to develop yourself professionally. I also think that doing this would really help us. There's constant complaints that we do the MDMP wargaming poorly. And I believe that's because we do all the other wargaming poorly or not at all, because the MDMP wargaming is an outgrowth of it. And if the better you understand wargames in general, the better you can say, okay, we're going to do it for this purpose, therefore these are the things we'll include or throw out. We're going to skip ahead. We're going to adjudicate this rapidly, so on and so forth. So I think it would be a great thing if we could get that from the top. Not sure if we're going to be able to pull it off, but we're talking to AMSO to see what we can do about it.
So getting the Commandant to do a wargaming list is one of those things that has been one of my great goals to get back for the service that I love. But Chris, any comments on this?
I had 3 comments, and now I've forgotten all 3 of them. I'll have to come back to it. I was just got my mind moved off to a different category.
Oh yeah, so I will do some tap dancing as you think about it. So so I teach a war game design course at 3 different universities, at Georgetown, at the U.S. Naval Academy, and Command and Staff at the Marine Corps University. And one of my majors, who is designing a game based on logistics in the defense of the Philippines in World War II, she just found out that she's going to be the XO for supply school, right? And she's so, she, at one point, her group hated my class and hated everything about game design for a little bit. But as they're getting close to the end and their game is coming together and they're running games for their classmates and for my midshipmen here at the yard, she's incredibly excited at the notion of using games at supply school as the XO. I think that is one of the great things that we, or at least I hope to do, is with my students, is have them design games and then take games out into the fleet, into the Marine Corps, into their brigades and squadrons. So Chris, hopefully that bought you enough time. Any comments of how we can bring gaming out into the operating forces?
Yes, and good tap dancing. Yes, I can hear it from here. No, I just wanted to say 2 things about gaming that I think are important to realize. So one of the, in terms of, I love the idea of a Commandant's war game list. I really like that. I think that's a fantastic idea. So I applaud that idea. I did not know that existed in the past, but that's cool. That's a cool idea. But a lot of, when we talk about not in the, required in the classroom or required as part of your official duties, don't forget that gaming, even wargaming, is largely a social activity, right? People engage in it because they like it, because it's fun to be with your friends and to do things with your friends. And so I think permission is important, but I'm not sure that's going to be enough. There has to be something else. And this is where I keep coming back to what's the Settlers of Catan of wargaming. I won't beat that drum any longer. The other piece, though, and I thought James made it brilliantly, and that is, games are about mechanics, right? Games are about the way in which, and a lot of, you talk to a lot of game designer, and I certainly look at it this when I design games. What I put on top of it, that's Chrome, right? That's the theme. It's about the underlying mechanics that are important. And you cannot, in this day and age, you simply have to play a lot of games to figure out the mechanics. So, for example, the mechanics of apples to apples are probably some of the easiest, simplest mechanics ever. I use those exact mechanics to design a game that we use here to teach new faculty how to teach using the Socratic method. It's not exactly the same as apples to apples, but it's similar enough. Had I never played apples to apples, I would not know that mechanic. I wouldn't have it in the back of my head, and I wouldn't be able to use it to help design a game that seems to work, right? In teaching new faculty how to use the Socratic method in their classrooms. Anybody who's ever played apples to apples immediately sees the connection. So it is about mechanics, and if that means playing a lot of games and forgetting about what the darn theme is and focusing on how does the designer get this to work, right? What are the tools and gears that they've used to get it to work? And I think that's really important, and all of that sort of needs to be bundled up to effectively create a wargaming culture, right? Sophisticated wargaming culture.
I know James has many strong feelings about the need to play and be familiar with lots of different games as a designer. But before I let him go on that rant, one thing I wanted to address that keeps coming up in the chat from the audience is, are there any recommendations you guys have other than the ones you already mentioned, like Battle for Moscow and Showdown, that you would recommend to other educators at different educational institutions? So I'll start with Kai.
I was gonna say I'm the worst person to start with because I play all our internal games that we have right now. One that's actually, if we're looking at very simple, I can have that, like very simple, basic, not as much with the advanced, is actually one that was started here, used to be part of a core course, has become a core part of our cadets sort of day-to-day squadron activities now, which is Island Rush. It is super basic, a super basic premise, super basic move types, but it is, and I think, Sebastian, here's something like to upload into your portal side of it, because we've now worked to finalize it so it works very nicely, and it can be played both as a tabletop as well as through a super simple digital interface too. So it doesn't require a lot of bandwidth, very basic graphics, very basic moves, but as a introduction to just, these are the principles of what it means to compete, I'm going to use that term again, in a war game, to have to develop a plan that you're going to go in with. I think it's one of the best out there. And it was started here. It's grown. I know some of the other academies have it now. Some of the, even just the colleges around in the areas use it. It's one of, I think, the best, just very basic games that doesn't require any advanced skill or knowledge. And so when I look at like something that comes in and you can go from off the couch wargaming, one of the best ones I think is out there.
Oh, that's great. So what about Chris?
So I just want to highlight, if we had the Game Genome Project, we wouldn't even be asking this question. We'd just be searching, just saying, right? I really think that it depends a lot on what it is you want to teach. I can't give, you tell me what you want to teach, and I can probably, almost any of us can probably give some good ideas about what games might teach that well. So I think it really starts with what it is, what are your learning objectives. I think that there's an awful lot of good video games that ought to be explored. I have not personally explored them. I've explored some of them, but I haven't explored all of them. I was just going through my Steam files to see if I could think of any ones. Two that jump out immediately to me is Command, Modern Air and Naval Operations. That ought to be something that people ought to be playing around with. And it looks sophisticated. Having played a little bit with it, it's pretty complex, but it could form the backbone of a really good introductory war game that's hyper realistic. The other one that I think it might be interesting is sort of the multiplayer versions of some of the Total War games. Might be really interesting because there's an awful lot of elements. There's diplomacy, there's economics, there's the military, of course, but they have also intelligence functions. They're also already built for online, right? So there may be some there that I think is maybe worth looking at. The one game that I always recommend to people who ask what game should I, what can I use in the classroom? And I've used this to teach how to how to communicate rules without ever sitting down and saying to someone, here are the rules and let me teach you how to play the game. If you've never played this game, it's gorgeous. It's a beautiful game. It's an online game. It's called Auditorium. You need to play it with speakers. So you got to have either headphones or speakers on. If you've never played Auditorium, it is absolutely one of my favorite games. And again, what I'm using it to teach, though, is how do you give instructions without giving instructions? How do you communicate without words, without telling people, without explaining? And Auditorium does. You can play Auditorium. There are no instructions to the game to speak of, and you still can figure out how to play it because they've done such a good job of managing the visual elements of the game that it's sort of obvious and intuitive from the start. And to me, that's one of the things that makes it a brilliant game. In addition to the brilliant, it is a brilliant game. It's one of the funnest games I think most people play, and simple. It is exactly what I'm looking for in terms of that perfect simple. It's not a war game at all, but if I could do a war game version of Auditorium, that's what I would do. So anyway.
No, that's great, and that's definitely something I will add to my own list. Thank you. And I always am worried to ask James for game advice or game recommendations because every time I do, I end up spending like $100. Literally 3 weeks ago, I bought Holdfast Korea because of James. So James, what are some recommendations from you?
Yeah, I've been typing out a list while we've been doing this so that this will be a slightly more organized answer. And Holdfast is on the list. So the first thing is that, just as Chris said, it depends on what you want to do. This is never a silver bullet solution. This will solve all of your problems. And I'm going to start in sort of an odd place by pointing at 2 games that my son has been playing over the years that really they've caused problems in the house because of how much he's learned from them. And I'll explain that comment in a minute. So those are Battle Academy 2 and Wargame Red Dragon. Battle Academy 2 is simple. It's easy to pick up. It's really, really elegantly designed. And it's great for World War II tactics. The issue that caused is that he first hit it while he was also in his stage of loving 20 questions. And my wife was irritated one day when the answer to the 20 questions thing she was trying to work through was not tank. It was not World War II tank. It was not U.S. tank. It was not Sherman. It was the Calliope variant of the Sherman tank. The reason that he knew that it existed and what it was and so on and so forth was Battle Academy. And he's currently enamored and obsessed by Wargame Red Dragon, and discussions with him are often cycling around, okay, let's work out combined arm tactics and how do you time the air and the artillery and the suppression and so on and so forth to come together into the symphony of destruction, which of course would be a terrible thing for our military officers to be learning and discussing. Some other games that have worked really well over the years that are very simple, easy to pick up, easy to teach. Race to the Rhine is a brilliant game on logistics in the race across France in 1944. Very easy to teach, and it often is eye-opening for students on the difficulty of planning log, which they often have ignored because they're not logisticians. Quartermaster General, which came up in the chat earlier, is a superb strategic level game on World War II. We have both sometimes used it in class. The place we most often use it is with visiting groups. There's the CGSC Foundation is a semi-official alumni association and support group for the Command and General Staff College. They will bring through groups of non-military people who want to look at the CGSC, get some of the experience, and often we get asked to provide a war game experience for them, and we've got 2 hours. So we can teach and play Quartermaster General most of the way through in 90 minutes and go to discussion. It's very easy to teach, and we can package the whole thing. Mike Dunn figured this out into the ends, ways, means construct for strategy so that we not only have them play the game, we've given them a CGSC lesson, they've discussed it, they walk out with something useful. On the computer, the Artemis Spaceship Bridge Simulator puts you in a Star Trek bridge. What would be terrible is a design for a ship, but is brilliant for the game. No station has all the information it needs. So if I am the helm, I'm looking through a soda straw at our position, and our commander, Captain Hunter, says, hey, go to Starbase 3. I'm sitting here saying, I don't know where Starbase 3 is. Hey, Science Officer Wheaton, what's the bearing? He tells me where I need to go, and so on and so forth. And one of our instructors, who has since unfortunately moved on to a completely different position, liked to use this as the beginning of the staff operations block. So we'd have 16 students in there as 3 ships all networked together and a Commodore trying to act in concert and discovering that the same skills they were finding they had to use in the game are the staff work skills that you need on a staff. The Holdfast series we have found has been a great hit because they are very simple and yet they are conducive to a lot of planning. The very clever mechanic in these is you've got resource points you get at the beginning of the turn. You spend those first on, I'm going to rebuild my units, and then you spend them on moving and fighting, and each of your units can move and fight. It can do that in any order you like. So the better you are at planning and sequencing, in theory, the better your operations are going to go through. The other story about my son here, the first one that we tried out in order to support an elective on the Russian campaign in World War II, was Holdfast Russia. I twisted my son's arm into playing it with me one weekend in order to test it out. He then twisted my arm into playing it another 5 times that weekend. So I figured, all right, this will work. And Holdfast Korea, which Sebastian recently picked up, we used with SAMs. One of the interesting things for me that came out of this, something I'm going to be quoting for probably quite a few years, is that one of the students who had been playing in the room I was in turned to me afterwards and said, I didn't think this was going to be very good because it's not detailed and it's not on a computer and all this. And he then said, but, quote, because it was manual, I had to engage with the science of war as well as the art of war. And he was saying that therefore it was really good. So I would agree with that. For history, we are big fans of Friedrich, of the new from Shaco Games, Napoleon 1806 and 1807. Those have, in a thing we didn't think would be possible, have replaced Napoleon the Waterloo campaign as our go-to operational level game for the Napoleonic Wars. As a cooperative game, we've found Hanabi is great, a puzzle game with limited information, and we will point instructors at that as a means of teaching the 8 elements of critical thought. And I have a suspicion that I'm supposed to shut up and go on. So I'm going to have one last thing to leave you with, which is on teaching the game in complexity. The key for teaching the game, we think, is 1, you begin with who are you and how do you win, and you tie everything back to it. And 2, you leave the complexity out. Tell the players there are things that will come up later. We will tell you about them when we can, and if need be, we will alter the game in order to keep you from being screwed by a rule that you didn't know was coming up, which is one of the advantages of game that is not, somebody commented that a computer game enforces the law as opposed to a board game has the rules. Nice thing about the board game or a computer game with lots of umpire flexibility is I can step in and reset things to avoid you being in trouble. And I think Sebastian's about to tell me to shut up, so I will.
So if you have more questions, feel free to reach out to all of our panelists today on Discord. They will be online, and they'll, I have no doubt, James and Chris and Kai will be answering all your questions in the chat. I would like to thank all of our panelists for their
Okay, sorry about that. It looks like we may have lost Sebastian, so I apologize for that last-minute hiccup.
It's okay, I'm back.
Okay, awesome.
So I just wanted to thank all of our panelists and our host, Chris, for connections online, and I'll pass it on to Gary to get the next conference in line, because I know I was told very strictly to get and finish up 5 minutes to give the next group enough time to get ready. But thank you, James, Chris, and Kai, for your wonderful time and your expertise. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you.